right. I say let's just get started and we can have whoever joins in join in as they come. But so first of all, happy Earth Day, everyone, and happy tail end of Environmental Education Week. We just finished a week of Environmental Education Week, and Jamie created some like wonderful YouTube videos that I will share in the chat as well. But so just to start, I am Sophie Arp. I am the executive director here at Friends of the Rainforest. I've been in this role since January of this year, but I've been with Friends of the Rainforest since the end of 2019. As I said before, Jamie is here, but she is at getting her car fixed. So we just ask for some patience. If you have any tech trouble, she'll be here to troubleshoot anything. But just know that she is mildly occupied. And like I said, using the chat for any additional questions that pop up. And then if you think of any questions after this event and something pops into your head, I will be sending out a follow-up email that will include Lindsay's email address. She is a wonderful resource that you can reach out to with your additional questions. So since you are here, I assume that you know something about Friends of the Rainforest, but I'm just going to give a little brief introduction of our programming just so you understand the scope of our work. So we have three main programs that we work with here within our organization. So the first is our environmental education programming. So we go into local schools in the St. Louis region and provide free tropical ecology rainforest lessons. These lessons are very hands-on and really just help connect kids to the rainforest. And so since the pandemic, our program has expanded. So now we offer virtual, hybrid, and take-home lessons as well. And like I mentioned, this last week, we've had our Environmental Education Week, and Jamie's created 4 wonderful videos. So if you'd like to check those out, we got some on blue morphos, some on how to create a community garden in St. Louis, etc. So those are great, and I would plug them again and ask that perhaps Jamie put the link in the chat as well. Our second program is our eco tours. And so we bring schools and community groups to the Children's Eternal Rainforest, and there they are able to conduct on the ground scientific study. They work with guides and staff there and just try to experience the rainforest in full and get a better understanding of the rainforest and the environment. And then the third program of ours is our conservation grants. And so these can be anything from environmental education grants to land protection, land purchase. And the main recipient of these conservation grants are MCL. So we are joined today here by Lindsay Stallcup, the executive director of MCL, the Monteverde Conservation League. And I will let her introduce herself and give you some more background information on her organization. So welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you, Sophie, and it's nice to be here today. So my name is Lindsay Stallcup. I have met some of y'all before and not met some of you. And I am speaking to you from Monteverde, Costa Rica at our main offices. The Monteverde Conservation League is the Costa Rican nonprofit organization that owns and is the steward of the Children's Eternal Rainforest, which is Costa Rica's largest private reserve. The Monteverde Conservation League, or the League, was founded 36 years ago by a group of neighbors here in Monteverde and has been going strong ever since. And so we're really proud to be an example of a long-term international grassroots conservation movement. And we're really proud and grateful to have Friends of the Rainforest and all of you as allies. Sophie, you're on mute.
You're right, I did mute that. Okay, so just to jump into our questions, so the last time that we hosted one of these Q&As was back in August of 2020. So it's been a while since then. And I know some people here may have attended that Q&A, but I was curious if you could just give us a quick summary of the challenges that your team was facing at that time and how things have changed since then.
Absolutely. So in 2020, like many conservation organizations around the world, we found ourselves in a bit of an existential crisis when tourism went from booming to a screeching halt. And literally overnight, we went from having visitors at our field stations to having the visitors, which were student groups at that point, be pulled out and put on airplanes to go home back to the United States before the border closed. And so when we talked in August 2020, we had just had to let 6 of our staff members go, which was about 20% of our staff, and the whole rest of our staff was working 50% time for 50% pay to try to make it through the rest of the year in the face of just a lot of uncertainty about what income would be like for 2021. We knew there was not going to be any visitation related income for 2020. And fortunately for us, about half of our income typically comes from visitation to our field stations and trails. And the other half of our operating income comes from payment for environmental services programs, which at least for 2020 and 2021 were not impacted. And so that, along with support from many, many people around the world in response to our fundraising campaign, including support from Friends of the Rainforest and very likely from some of you, allowed us to get our staff back to full-time as of February 2021. One of the great ironies is that although the money to pay staff and tourist visitation dropped incredibly, the amount of work to be done did not drop at all, because the ongoing work of forest patrols, of maintenance, of administration of the reserve, the need for environmental education never decreased. So as far as operations go, we had a full workload. And as of February 2021, we've been back at full time, and we've since then been able to rehire the positions that were let go as well. As far as tourism visitation, we are seeing, as of November, December of last year, traditional tourism has been bouncing back, particularly in Monteverde. One of the particularities of the Children's Eternal Rainforest is that a huge portion of our visitors are not typical tourists, rather they are student groups like the eco trips that Sophie mentioned. And so study abroad groups have been a lot slower to respond, because coordinating a group of students, particularly if you're a university in the United States, is a whole process that's very much more complicated than a family or a couple or a group of friends deciding to go on a trip to Costa Rica. But we have been seeing those numbers return to somewhat approaching normal again as of last month. So we have our fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's exciting news. Hopefully it continues that way. So a lot of people are here today because they wanted to hear more about your land purchase program. So for those who perhaps are new to your whole land purchase program of the Monteverde Conservation League, how do you go about prioritizing different parcels of land? What are the considerations that you weigh in these decisions?
Yeah, so if it's okay, I'm gonna share my screen quickly to share a map. And I will just give a caveat by saying that this map is now outdated, which is a good thing, because it means that some of the properties in question have been purchased. But if you look at this map, you can see the area that is green is the Children's Eternal Rainforest, and we have several properties that are outlined in red, which are basically holes in the Children's Eternal Rainforest. And then we have these properties down at the bottom of the screen in yellow, and the map continues down off the bottom of the screen, which is essentially going down the Pacific slope. And so our focus for any new land purchase, when funds are available to make it happen, is increasing connectivity, whether that is filling in an existing inholding or hole within our reserve, or increasing connectivity, in this case downslope in the Bellbird Biological Corridor along the Pacific coast. But it could, or the Pacific slope, sorry, not the Pacific coast. But in the future, it could include other properties that provide continuity or connectivity towards different reserves that aren't necessarily in the Bellbird Biological Corridor. And so this map, actually, the part of it that's outdated, where there's 2 small properties that have a 1 and a 2 on them, those were actually purchased a number of years ago. This 4, which is a tiny 4 inside of this red property, is the Maximo Ramirez property that we just purchased, to give you an example. And so,
I was just going to ask, just for clarification, who owns these properties all around?
So the properties are all owned by private landowners, either an individual or a family. And for the most part, in particular, the ones that represent inholdings or holes, they're properties that the family or owner just, for whatever reason, didn't sell when most of the original land purchase that the league was doing happened. And then the properties down at the bottom of this map, going down the Pacific slope in the Bellbird Biological Corridor, are properties that weren't originally considered as part of the core block of the reserve. But that type of forest happens to be particularly threatened on a national and regional level. It's a type of forest that happens to be very compatible with people and coffee and cows, which means that it was cut down to make room for people, coffee, and cows throughout Costa Rica. So it's an underprotected life zone or ecosystem type throughout the country.
Yeah. So when it comes to purchasing these properties, obviously there is the financial aspect of buying up these huge parcels of land. But what are the other challenges when purchasing the land, either before the trouble that you run into in the process of buying them, or the afterwards, once you own the land? What challenges come up then?
I guess before I forget, I just wanted to say that we are currently in the process of updating. We maintain a database of properties that are available, meaning that the owner has come to us and said, here's the plan, here's the documents related to my property. I'm interested in selling this property to you. But in some cases that could have been 5 or 10 or 20 years ago that they brought us that information, right? Or it could have been last month. And so we're in the process of updating that database, which includes, eliminating properties that are no longer for sale, either because we bought them or someone else did. Some of the properties formerly didn't have proper legal title, and now they do, which makes them eligible for us to purchase them, and price. So it can be, addressing the question you just asked, I think one of the big challenges is it can be kind of a moving target. And I think also that we don't usually have a lot of money available for land purchase. It hasn't been a focus for the past years, which doesn't mean that it's not a priority. We just have had a lot of priorities related to operations and taking care of the land that we already have. And so it's tricky because you're talking about neighbors who are real people, and approaching them to say, hey, is your property still for sale, and how much do you want for it, creates some type of expectation on their part that may not be realistic, right? So it's kind of a tricky route to navigate, to be able to get the information you want without generating expectations by the people that oh, look, the league's buying land again, they're going to buy my property, which may not be true, because we need to know how much the property costs to see if we can even begin to think about raising the money to buy it. So I think that is challenging.
And for the most part, are your neighbors, when you do approach them, are they excited to sell? Are they wanting to sell? Or do you have neighbors that are a bit trickier to work with?
It's completely variable. I think the properties that people are interested in selling at prices that we are able to reasonably consider, it's variable, because if people have properties that are central to Monteverde, then you're in a real estate market, like a real estate development market. And there's no way that we could hope to pay what people are currently charging in Monteverde, where they're not charging by the hectare or charging by the acre, they're charging by the square meter. And then there's properties which are like the ones on the map that I just showed you that are relatively inaccessible for anything other than cattle farming or conservation. Like there's not public services, there's not an access road. And so those, I think, are the properties that we are able to consider price wise. And in terms of the owner wanting to sell, a lot of the properties, especially in the Bellbird corridor, and it's the case for the Maximo Ramirez property that we just acquired, is because the landowner is getting older, and his or her, but mostly his sons and daughters are not interested in farming. Nobody wants to go to the farm. Dad's getting too old to keep going to the farm on his own, for example. And so it's kind of a generational change, right? Where there was in the case of the Maximo Ramirez family property, there's a lot of emotional attachment to the property. Maximo held out for as long as he could, but he finally said, I'm getting too old to go to this property. My kids no longer want to go there. Like, we're in a financial situation. I think it's time. And I think that's the case for a lot of these properties. And they range in size. Some of them are as small as 5 hectares, and some of them are as large as, so 5 hectares is maybe like 12 acres. And some of them are as large as, let's say, 400 acres, 500 acres, and everything in between.
Yeah, so you've mentioned the Maximo Ramirez property a few times, so we will get to that in a moment. But just going over, so after you've purchased the land and secured the deed and everything, like what are the challenges that pop up then?
Mm-hmm. So I think that my answer to everything will be, it depends. It depends on the property itself, right? So for properties that are on the border of the Children's Eternal Rainforest, which is the case for most of them, then we acquire an immediate responsibility to, I want to say, like, secure the border, but it's a property that people are able to access relatively more easily than something in the middle of the reserve. So it's something new that we need to take care of. We need to put up signage. We need to clear the borders. We need to decide if it's something where we'll maintain, permanent markers, or if it's a property that borders a cattle farm, if we need to put up fencing, and we need to include it in our forest patrols. In the case of a property like the Ramirez property that we just bought, which was an island in the middle of the reserve, maybe the case isn't putting up borders because it just bordered ourselves on 3 sides. So it's actually new borders that we don't have to take care of. But it's a property that a lot of people historically have visited for bird watching and hiking. And so now we have this issue of, like, tourists going to an area that's no longer open for tourism because now it's ours. It doesn't belong to the family. So it depends. If it's a property that has a significant amount of pasture on it, or degraded areas, then we also want to decide if we want to try to actively reforest it, if we are just going to let it regenerate naturally, which is typically the case. If there are areas that we're interested in maintaining open for future research purposes, for example, or future, studies, bird watching, what have you. So depending on the property, I think the particular challenges vary.
And for these pieces of land that require that immediate additional protection and everything, could you explain, for those who might not know, just what your 50-40-10 policy is?
Yeah, so our board of directors adopted a land purchase and protection policy a number of years ago, basically in response to the fact that the original land purchase that the league did used all of the money to buy the land, which I think was absolutely appropriate in that particular time and place, because the crisis was, buy this forest before it gets cut down. The reality is that buying the land is not the last step. That's the first step, right? After you purchase the land for conservation, then you have to continue to take care of it. And that means forest patrols, and it means clearing the boundaries, but it also means administratively, maybe not that particular property, but the operations of the whole organization, everything from, maps and record keeping to accounting to taxes to, everything has a cost. And so the idea is to use half of the money to purchase the land and half of the money to make it eternal. So 50% is used for land purchase, 40% is used for protection, and 10% is used to be invested in our endowment fund or our forever fund to create more of a fund that will continue to support conservation of the whole reserve in the future.
Great. And that just also goes to show how there's the price set by the sellers, but how purchasing land for you can be an incredibly costly thing because you have to have all these funds ready and available for that protection aspect as well.
Great.
So now going back to your most recent land purchase, and this one is particularly relevant for us at Friends of the Rainforest because we helped to fund this, and it kind of seemed to have popped up relatively quickly, like the everything moved really fast. Could you tell us a little bit about this property and why it was so important and strategic?
Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen again. So this, if you look at see if I can make I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can zoom this in a little bit first. Hang on. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Almost Irish. So this is a property. So in the inset at the bottom, you can see its location within the larger Children's Eternal Rainforest. It's a property that the League has been interested in purchasing since the 1980s or the 1990s, sorry, when most of the other properties in the San Gerardo region were purchased, but the family never wanted to sell. Don Maximo never wanted to sell. And even when I started as director of the Conservation League 6.5 years ago, the message was basically, over my dead body, I will sell this to the League. Like, no way, no how, not happening. And then within a couple of years, he came to me and said, I think the League should own my property. I will sell it to you for this ridiculous, exorbitant price. And I was like, okay, well, at least now he's willing to sell, but he's crazy. That's way too much money. And then since about 6 months ago, I guess more, it's because it's already April, but maybe like 7 or 8 months ago, he approached me and said, I sold half of my property to my niece and nephew. It's not working out. I want out. What he really had done was they created a corporation. And so he was a half shareholder and his niece and nephew were the half shareholder. And I said, I don't want half of your shares in a corporation. We want half of your property or your whole property. And so it was kind of this back and forth with Don Maximo and his niece and her husband. But at the end of the day, it was because they were in a really tricky financial situation because of the pandemic. They had purchased his niece and nephew. They had gotten involved because they wanted to develop a tourism project in the farm. And it basically, their purchasing the property coincided directly with the beginning of the pandemic. And they both work in tourism. And so they were just in a pinch and said, we have to sell this. And we really hope that you will buy it because we don't want to sell it to someone else, but we will if we have to. Coincidentally, we had sold a small property on the eastern border of the Children's Eternal Rainforest, less than 1 hectare last year. It was a property that was donated by a family. It's not contiguous with the rest of the reserve, and it had some old infrastructure that was in really bad shape. And we had decided several years ago that we were going to sell that property to invest the money in something different because also most of that property is over a river and a stream, which for one thing makes it illegal to build anything or fix the buildings that you have, but also means that it's protected by law because pretty much the whole property is in the area of protection of the river. So its conservation is relatively guaranteed. We found a really conservation compatible buyer for that property last year and sold it. And so when I started to think about it, I said, you know, between the sale of the Frost property and the reserve that we have for land purchase, we're really close to what we need to buy Maximo's property. And so I talked to Maggie Eisenberger, who looks like is in this Zoom with us right now. And I said, Maggie, how are y'all on land purchase funding? And it just so happened that the amount that Friends of the Rainforest had available for land purchase was just enough for us to be able to complete the purchase. So I really felt like a case of the stars aligning at exactly the right moment. And if you look at the map that I hopefully am still sharing, it's this area that's outlined in red, and you can see that a little bit less, I feel like maybe 35 or 40% of the property in this map is pasture, and the rest of the property is forest. The real limit of the property is following my cursor. It's actually the river. The plan is not the most fabulous plan ever. And so it's a property that's mostly forested, and the pasture that shows up on this map is also beginning to regenerate since this aerial photo was taken. And so we actually have, this property is receiving payment for environmental services from the Costa Rican government. Maximo and his family had just signed a new contract, and so we were able to inherit that contract. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's something. And then we're hoping to apply for the area that's pasture for natural regeneration, which is a different type of environmental service contract. So awesome. It looks like there's a question from Mr. Shepherd, and he's on mute.
Oh.
Where is the public road in that property?
That is a great question. The public road ends at this property. So the public road begins, depending on who you ask, it's a public road or it's a neighbor access road. We would strongly prefer if it was a neighbor access road, but it starts at the Santa Elena Reserve, if you're familiar with the area, and it continues to our San Gerardo field station. You would turn left to go to our San Gerardo field station, and this road continues about 4 more kilometers down the hill, and it ends at this property. You're on mute.
Sorry, that's before the river?
So have you been down there? I'm curious. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Many times I've been down there. Yeah, that's why I'm
okay.
Sure. I actually met Maximo once. But
that's fantastic.
I forget. Is this on the far side of the river from the station, or?
Exactly. So if you have been down there, there's a bridge, a kind of scary looking bridge that you cross to get to Maximo's property, and that river is the limit between the last remaining private island and what is now the Children's Eternal Rainforest, but what was Maximo's property. So we inherited that bridge too. Speaking of work to be done with newly acquired properties, now we get to do an engineering work of fixing the bridge.
I only met Maximo once, but he was very cordial, and we spent a while with him.
He's great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool.
So I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, Sophie, but I was just curious. Is the Torres farm now part of the, is that with the Torres farm there?
Yes, I'm gonna reshare my screen for the people who do not know what the Torres farm is. So in San Gerardo, I'm doing it with the cursor, there's these 2 holdouts, and the smaller one on the right, number 4, which I'm sure you can't see the number 4, but that was Maximo's farm, and that's now part of the Children's Eternal Rainforest. And then this larger one, which is 140 hectares, which whatever 140 times 2.5, it's that many acres, maybe like 400 acres. That is the Torres property, which is also known as the Bertrand property, which some people call the Cuban mafia property. But that property continues to be a holdout in that area. And the owners both, the couple passed away. So Torres lost that property to a couple who lived in the United States. And they both died within the past few years, and their son is now the owner. But he has a very money-hungry lawyer as the intermediary between us and him. So the current asking price, Maggie, try not to faint, when I asked them recently, was between $1 million and $1.5 million, which is up from $450,000, which was the last conversation I had with Maria Elena Bertrand before she died. So it's still there and it's not ours.
Thank you.
That's just an incredible piece of property.
I don't want to get too wordy, but Lindsay, those open areas were actually great places. The pastures, actually, they were very sort of biodiverse and sort of had different things from the forest. So I don't know whether you have any long-term plan to maintain pastures, but
I absolutely agree with you. And actually near our San Gerardo station, we have maintained a couple of hectares in pasture. People sometimes say, why are there cows in the reserve? Why is there pasture? And the reason is because pasture and edge does create really high biodiversity areas and also really great bird watching areas. And so one of our objectives for the next few months is to take a trip down to the Maximo Ramirez property with the board and a few others to identify what are areas that we would like to let regenerate and what are areas that we strategically would like to keep open for exactly that reason.
Great. Thank you so much for chiming in, Julian.
Yeah, awesome questions.
Yeah, really. But so kind of on the topic of reforestation, letting the forest regenerate, what have your processes been in the past when you purchase new land? Has it simply been just the case of letting the rainforest go, or, you know, what kind of like case by case basis, what do you see in that?
So largely, yes. Most of the properties that are now part of the Children's Eternal Rainforest were similar. Maybe the proportions of forest versus pasture or intervened areas was different, but most of the properties were mostly forested. In this case, you know, there's also a huge amount of forest bordering the land that's open. And particularly on the Atlantic slope where it's so rainy, it doesn't take very long for the forest to regenerate on its own. It doesn't necessarily need a lot of active regeneration on our part. Although I did see someone just put a question in the chat, and I'll just tackle that really quick. If there were invasive species that we were worried about, then I think we would tackle those right away, although that isn't typically the case. And I worked in invasive species removal in Southern California for a couple of years, and it's definitely a whole different ballgame. Most of the species that tend to be invasive here are invasive along the edges, but get crowded out once the forest comes back. And so, you know, the Monteverde Conservation League does have a really long history of doing reforestation. And, you know, we have produced more than 1 million trees in our nurseries over the years that have been planted. Most of those have been planted in neighboring properties, helping to reforest, helping to do windbreaks, helping to do living fences, to create connectivity and biodiversity in properties that a lot of them continue to also be working farms. And our reforestation nursery now gives a lot of trees to local aqueducts and schools and things like that. Although it's located in one of our properties where we have done a lot of active reforestation, Finca but primarily it's just a question of letting things regenerate.
Great. I guess I'll give a moment if anyone has any other specific land purchase questions, or we can, if they pop up, we can get to them at the end. I did want to just take some time to talk about your environmental education programming that you've had for years and years now. If you could just, tell us a little bit about it, the history of it, and kind of its current status post pandemic craze.
So yes, so the league has been doing environmental education ever since it was founded 36 years ago. So I'm not going to tell you about all 36 years, but I can speak to our more current and recent efforts. We have a full-time environmental educator who works with elementary schools, primarily along the eastern border of the reserve. We also are active in Monteverde with other organizations. So for example, today, the Monteverde Environmental Education Commission is doing an activity for older adults in the different reserves in the community. So we have a group of about 15 older adults at Bajo del Tigre today doing a guided hike and some different, I think there's like a biodiversity bingo game and stuff like that. Typically we work with kids, but it's fun to work with different audiences. During the pandemic, it was ironic because we saw such an increase in infractions, whether it was people cutting trees or people poaching or people extracting various things from the forest, that it really highlighted the need for environmental education, specifically at the time when we weren't able to do very much. But in 2021, we were able to get a grant from the Costa Rican government to bring family groups. So here, in kind of the high point of the pandemic, you were allowed to do things in your social bubble. So we got funding to be able to bring 27 different family groups to the forest for a whole day activity that included a guided hike and a workshop on native trees, a workshop on recycling, a little activity on how to kind of be a citizen defender of the environment in your community. It included lunch. And that was a really great way to get people into the forest. I think we were able to bring almost 170 people from kindergartners to grandparents in their family groups to the forest. And that was really neat to work with that audience because we typically work with classrooms, but it was very cool to be able to work across generations. And then as we were able to go back to in-person activities, we were really fortunate to receive a grant from Friends of the Rainforest that allowed us to do 17 field trips to the rainforest with students from local elementary schools. I think 5 different schools and 1 orphanage we were able to include in that, in those activities as well. And so almost 300 students were able to participate in those field trips to the forest in the last few months of 2021. And we were able to
that reminds me, I was just
there we go.
Share these images.
Awesome.
While you're speaking.
And we were also able to go back into the schools, at least one of the schools, which was a little bit more receptive to in-person instruction. And so we did 10 classroom visits towards the end of 2021 as well, reaching about 200 different students during those activities. I think I would say that for the kids in the communities that are neighboring the reserve, this is often the first time they visit the rainforest, even though they live right close to it. And that tends to be the case for some of the adults too, some of the parents that come with them. And so this funding is really key. It's important to go to the schools because it's a cost-effective way to do environmental education programming through talks and workshops. But it's so important to also reward the kids with a trip to the forest that's really hands-on and really a special treat for everyone.
And remind me of your education coordinator's name. I've only heard
Maria Fernanda.
Wonderful things about her. So
Maria Fernanda.
Perfect.
We just got another grant from a different organization that will enable us to continue with probably a similar amount of field trips over the next few months. And those pictures that Sophie was just showing are from our Finca Stadier Visitor Center, which is near La Tigre de San Carlos, and the overlook is looking out over the community of La Tigre.
Julian, did you have another question? I heard you chiming in for a moment there. No, okay. All right, so I wanted to circle back. I got a couple questions that were sent through the chat from donors. But so one of them was going back to the land purchase. Could you give us, and I'm sure it varies, but any details on when you're looking at these pieces of land, what's the general cost, US dollar per acre?
So it depends, but it depends on where the property is located and how big it is, and kind of what the market or lack of market is for it otherwise. And I would say that, for example, for the Maximo Ramirez property, we paid more per hectare or per acre than we would like to do for pretty much any other property. But it's possible that our concept of how much land costs is outdated, right? That's part of the reason we need to update our prices. But there was also an opportunity cost there where it's an island in the middle of our reserve that was going to be sold to someone. And so I felt very confident in our decision to purchase the property for conservation, and the slightly more than what we would have liked to pay, I felt like was an investment in not having other random neighbors start whatever new project they were going to start in the middle of our reserve. So there's kind of a big range. One of the properties that we just looked at that we kind of have our eye on the Pacific Slope looks like it's going to cost somewhere around $1,500 per acre under the land purchase and protection setup. And I think that is on the low end of the range, and it would go up to around $4,000 per acre would be my large range. So $1,500 to $4,000 per acre. And I think if it's a bigger property, you would expect to pay less per acre compared to a smaller property. But there's a lot of other factors in there too. For example, that $4,000 per acre is approximately the price that one of the properties that was on our list on the eastern border of the Bend just sold for to another private individual. So it's a real price that some real buyer was willing to pay. And it's similar to what we paid for Maximo's property, to be honest. So
yeah, great. Thank you for all that information. And one last question that I got from Peter just now was, have you ever considered implementing solar panels in your near your field stations?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Peter. Thank you for the question. We have, and we do. And so part of it is a question of getting the technology and making the investment and maintaining it, right? But we do have a little bit of solar. We could probably have more. At our San Gerardo field station, we have solar as a backup. Our main source of electricity at the San Gerardo field station is actually hydropower. And this month, hopefully, we are making an important investment to completely redo our hydro system at San Gerardo because it's outdated and it's been giving us a ton of problems. So I think that is going to run us somewhere around $12,000 by the time it's all said and done, probably a little bit more. Which includes replacing the turbine, replacing all the 800 and something meters of cable from the turbine up to the station, replacing a bunch of other stuff, but it's an investment that has to be done. So I think, and then the solar panels at San Gerardo are kind of the secondary system. At Poco Sol, we don't have solar panels for electricity generation, but we have solar water heaters, where so actually like the water is being heated in tubes on the roof of the station. And those are scheduled to have maintenance this month too. This is the month of renewable energy maintenance. And I think that solar could be an interesting option at some of our other locations, including our offices or Bajo del Tigre, but we haven't looked into that yet.
Awesome.
And that is an option. So For example, at the Maximo Ramirez property, there was a solar panel there. Like ISE, the government electric utility, offered solar panels for remote properties that didn't have other options for electricity. And that's how we got the solar panels at San Gerardo. It's a service that's offered by ISE. And I have a friend who has that on his farm too. Unfortunately, they don't offer it anymore. And so Maximo didn't have theirs active anymore. So we lost the opportunity to be able to have that. But that's another property that historically had a hydroelectric plant, a small Pelton wheel at the station or at the house.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much. So now would be a chance if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to unmute or throw them in the chat. Otherwise, that was all of the questions that I had previously sent to me. Yeah, thank you.
And if I missed something in the chat, please tell me, because I wasn't looking at the chat while I was talking. So
we did just get a question in from Nyan saying, are there buildings on the new property that you will keep and use?
That's one of the decisions that we need to make. There's a rustic, we call it a rancho, like a rustic shelter on the property. I suspect that it is not worth trying to maintain that structure, and that we probably will use it until it falls down. but it's one of the things that we need to talk about is what do we want to do there? And what type of structure might we like to have there, like a little casita, a little house for researchers or for forest rangers, to be able to use in that area. It's at the bottom of a really cool elevational gradient from the Santa Elena Reserve, which is at the kind of the top of the Continental Divide, maybe like 1,600 meters, all the way down to 800 or so meters at the Maximo's property. So in addition to just like operational and forest patrol needs, I think there's interesting research potential. But when you have the building that's there is very old, and it's wood, and it's in various stages of falling down depending on which side of the building you stand on. So I feel like probably we wouldn't try to maintain that building, but I don't know the answer to that because the board hasn't done their trip yet. And someone may decide that we want to maintain part of it for historical reasons, for example.
Does that ever come up in your land purchase agreements? Any do the sellers ever add something about wanting to maintain their property there, or?
I don't think so. This is only the second land purchase that I have been a part of. We purchased about 3 hectares pretty soon after I became director to even out a really tricky border. There was a really tricky limit to maintain, and actually Friends of the Rainforest helped and contributed to that land purchase as well, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the people present today were key to that purchase being able to happen. And that one definitely didn't have any infrastructure on it. I know in this case, the family has a lot of sentimental attachment to the property and had said, we want to go have like a lunch, or we want to go have a visit or whatever. And I think that's something that we would, not object to. But I don't think that we would agree to maintaining structures on properties that we buy or that are donated. And exactly what happened in the case of the Frost property that we sold last year is a perfect example. It was such a commitment to try to maintain that structure, a 20-year-old wooden structure in the rainforest, literally on top of a stream. It was just so complicated. One of the properties that we have our eye on now has a really old and kind of rickety rancho on it, and I'm sure that we wouldn't maintain that either. It's also tricky when you have structures like that in areas that are problematic. Some of the areas of the reserve are more problematic for poaching than others. When it's in an area near the border or that's problematic, then having a building there that people can get into is a double-edged sword. It's really useful for our staff but you can also be providing shelter to precisely the people that you don't want to be having shelter there, right? So it's a bit of a debate.
Wonderful.
I do have some more questions if
Yes.
you're open to them.
Go right
I'm
ahead.
happy to answer all the questions.
Well, several questions actually. Does the league still get significant support from ESAT as ecosystem payment service payments?
That's a great question. So I don't think we ever have gotten support directly from ESA, which is the government electric utility, but we do get two different types of payment for environmental service. One of them comes from the government through FONAFIFO, which is the National Fund for Forestry Financing, which is a part of the Ministry of the Environment and Energy. And about 50% of our gross income comes from payment for environmental services contracts. It's something that we feared would be affected in 2020 just because the government had no money, even though we had existing contracts. They're either 5 to 10 year contracts, 5 or 10 year contracts. We thought that we maybe wouldn't get paid on time. And fortunately, that wasn't the case. For 2021, the budget was about 1/8 or 1/7 the size on a national level of what it normally is, exactly because of the pandemic. Most of the money for payment for environmental services by the government comes from a fuel tax. And since nobody was driving and there were no tourists and no turismo buses or anything like that, the budget was just shot. And yet we still managed to do okay with new PES contracts in 2021. We still were able to sign a pretty typical number of new contracts. So each year some old contracts expire. So we're in this constant race to make sure we get some new ones. And for 2022, we'll see. Because of the skyrocketing fuel prices, some of the political actors have been saying, well, we should eliminate the fuel tax. And we're like, no, but there's a fundamental flaw in financing environmental protection with a fuel tax in a country that has a goal of reducing emissions and relying on, right? So there's a catch-22 that's inherent in the system to begin with. The other type of payment for environmental services that's directly related to hydroelectric projects is that the league has had historically 2 contracts with private hydroelectric projects. One on the Peñas Blancas River, which is the one you see if you have been to the Poco Sol field station. And the other one is on the Esperanza River, kind of over near Finca Stadier. Both of those were private contracts signed with the hydroelectric company, and they pay us X dollars per hectare per year for the environmental service of water resource protection. So we're not charging them for water because you can't do that. The water belongs to the government, but we're charging them for the abundant and clean water resource that is coming out of in the case of the Peñas Blancas one, 10,000 hectares of children's eternal rainforest that they have upstream of their dam. And in the case of Rio Esperanza, it's about 3,000 hectares. And if you compare that to nearby dams that don't have forest upstream, the economic benefit to these companies is just mind-blowing when you see the sediment in the dams that don't have that forest upstream. Both of those companies, about 8 years after each contract was signed, sued us to get out of the contract and to also ask for us to pay back all the money they had ever given us. So the first contract was signed in 1998 and they sued us in 2006, and that thing is still in court. Everyone cross your fingers and do a little prayer because we think that it might be finally over, but I'm not celebrating yet. But if it is over, it is a very good thing for us. And the other one, the contract was signed in 2008 and we got sued like New Year's Day of 2016. And that one was when I was director. And we settled that with them in an arbitration process that was mutually satisfactory for everybody. Basically, they were able to redirect money that they already pay in taxes for water use through FONAFIFO, the government environmental service payment folks, and make it eventually get to us. So we still get our money, but they get to take it out of money that they're already paying to the government. So that was a huge relief also.
Good. Did I hear
Also,
up to 50% of your growth costs? Is that what you said?
50% of our growth, so of our total annual income, is from payment for environmental services.
Great.
Yeah. And it's not the majority. I guess I should also say that of the 56,000 acres of children's eternal rainforest, maybe 10 to 15% are participating in that program at any given time. So it's not like the whole thing is receiving PES. There's caps on the amount of acreage that any individual or business can have in the program at any given time. So.
Alrighty. Well, Julian, you said you had several questions. I don't know if that answered all of them or if you had a few more.
I do actually. How is the Guard Corps? How many guards have you got now? And what I remember there was quite a bit of poaching near Pocosol for pigs.
Yeah. So the guards are great. They have been doing a fantastic job. We have 4 forest rangers, which has been the core of our forest ranger staff since I've been director. Our head forest guard, who some of you may know, his name is Hernan Chacon, is pretty much on permanent disability. So we have a new guard coordinator this year. His name's Alonso. He's been with us for more than 10 years and he's been doing a great job. And we have other staff that support the rangers when needed, including our maintenance staff. I think one of the really big issues that we dealt with in 2021, I'm just giving you like the long answer to all of your questions, but you can tell me to cut it off at any time. The teamwork and communication is always really challenging. And I think the geography and just the expanse of the area that we're dealing with makes that a particular challenge. And we had having everyone on 50% time and pay really also threw a monkey wrench into things, because it's already hard to get everybody together and keep everybody communicating. And then nobody was overlapping the way they used to. 2021, we did a lot of work on team building and ironing out some of those wrinkles. And I'm really, really proud to say that for the first time since I've been director, all of our forest protection staff and all of our maintenance staff worked together for all of Easter week doing joint operatives where the whole team worked together. And it was really positive to see that. And poaching is still a problem. I think it's largely some people that are kind of holdouts that we just have to wait for them to get so old enough that they don't want to go poaching anymore, or their knees get wrecked or whatever. But it continues to be a problem, particularly near Pocosol and in the properties bordering the communities on the eastern edge of the bend. Although it also is a problem on the southern border, which is kind of a frequently neglected area because it's hard to get to. But we keep after them.
I guess I'd just like to say that I love the Bosque de los Niños, and I support you strongly, and I've been there many times with student groups and also
That's so great.
Private groups. So,
well, that's fantastic. I would really love to meet you on your next trip whenever that happens, and thank you for your support.
Yeah.
Nyan, did you want to share the shirt that you're wearing?
Sure. I got to go in 2007 with Rachel and a teacher group. And so I'm wearing the shirt from the 20th anniversary.
Oh, wow.
And on the back, tell me whether to get higher or lower, because I can't see what the camera's doing.
That's
we can see it. You did good.
It was a wonderful trip, and I'm so glad I got to go and stay at San Gerardo. And I think for the first place we stayed was called the Bellbird Sanctuary or something. We stayed someplace for a few nights, and then we went to San Gerardo for a few nights.
That's fantastic.
That's how I got connected from Oregon, because the previous year, Rachel had come and taught a class for teachers in Oregon about the rainforest. And they announced there's a possibility of a trip to the rainforest a year from now. So in 2006, I took the class. And then in 2007, the tour did end up happening. Had a great time.
Thank you so much for
That's
sharing.
so great. Peter just put that he has to go to a solar job. I thought you said you had to go. Sorry.
All right. Oh, he
Oh, it looks like he did have to go.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. Like I said, if you have any follow-up questions, I'm going to send up a follow-up email with the recording of this, as well as Lindsay's email address. You can always address questions directly to her. And yeah, I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your Earth Day. If any of you are, I'm trying to remember where you all are from. I feel like most of you are not in St. Louis, but if you are in St. Louis, we will have a Earth Day at Forest Park this weekend, as well as the Butterfly House in Chesterfield. There's 2 really awesome events going on, so we will be there. Come say hi if you're around. But yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Lindsay and Sophie.
Thank you all for connecting.
course.
This was so nice to touch base with everyone.
Yeah, you guys did a great job of the questions and answers and everything. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Lindsay. I always your
Yeah.
knowledge is so wonderful to hear.
All right.
It's Mark
happy to do
Wainwright.
it.
I think his name is Mark Wainwright, who is he still involved in the Monteverde area?
He is. He's still on our board of directors.
Okay. I was very impressed with him and all that he taught us while we were down there.
Mark's amazing.
Yeah, it was a great chance to see how art and science can be combined. Because he did
Absolutely.
so much illustration of animals and things on charts and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thank you.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting. All right, bye, everyone. To learn more about Friends of the Rainforest partnership with the Monteverde Conservation League, our education programming, or our eco tours, please visit our website at www.friendsoftherainforest.org. Thanks.